Hey everyone, so what you see behind me is very typical of sort of the custom build process that I do quite a bit when I'm building bikes for clients. This is actually a 29 plus full suspension mountain bike, and I don't know if you want to see exactly how these are put together and the actual construction of them. And I can do that in a later video. I do have some footage of where I've gotten to so far, and I can continue to shoot more as I finish it. So if you want to see that sort of thing, just put a comment down below, and I can maybe put together another video for that. But what I want to talk about today is how I go about taking the person's fit and integrating it into the bike and making it a reality. Because when you're building something this specific and you have so many choices as we do and constraints set on you by the client and by their fit, etc., you really have to do a lot of the legwork ahead of time. So let me explain a little bit about how we got to where we are right now. Now, the first place we have to start is with the saddle height. We have to go there first because it's going to be sort of the basis for everything else that we're building off of. So easy enough to kind of measure from the center of the bottom bracket to the top of the saddle. It does help that the saddle we're going to use is the same saddle he has on his old bike, so it kind of makes things a little bit simpler that way. And again, setting the height is easy enough, but what the height affects is also the fore-aft, and the fore-aft is the next step. We have to make sure we get this seat in the right position front to back. This is where it starts to get a little bit tricky and where doing some math ahead of time really helps. Because of course, as the saddle goes up, as the saddle goes higher, it's going further back because of our seat angle. And so I knew this person's fit. We actually had some of those numbers ahead of time, of course. And so what you have to do, or what I like to do anyway, is to actually just do some simple trigonometry. And what we end up trying to figure out is, okay, with the person's saddle set at this height, how far behind the bottom bracket is the center of the saddle when we're at that height? And we can figure this out by just actually taking the cosine of the seat angle, and we know that we're going to use the seat height, the total height, as our hypotenuse, and that will give us basically our setback, which is the adjacent leg of that triangle for that angle. And so again, we can use the cosine of that seat angle to figure that out. Because setting this saddle height and setting the saddle fore-aft, it plays a role in the overall length of the bike, or the cockpit distance for the rider. Now, why do we have to go through all this? Well, because we wanted to make sure we chose the right parts. Again, I don't want to buy multiple versions of, for instance, this seat post. And that's the one we settled on. I was able to figure out that we could get away with a 0 millimeter setback seat post. And so that's why you see the straight one on here. Now we move on to the bar position. And again, it's more math. We have to work within the constraint of, for this client, he wanted to run as short a stem as possible. And he actually favored, if possible, he favored this very short 32 millimeter Renthal stem. And he also liked the Renthal handlebar, which we'll get to in a second. So now it was my job to determine, okay, now based on where we need his hips with that saddle fore-aft relative to his feet, is a 32 millimeter stem going to be appropriate, or what length of stem will be appropriate for him in order to make the right overall length, overall cockpit distance. Now we can look up a lot of the geometry of the frame ahead of time. It's just a stock frame. We didn't do any custom adjustments this time around. And so we can look up the frame's stack and reach, and we can look up the effective top tube and all these things. And I know some people will out there say, well, oh, the reach measurement that you look up on is by far the most objective. It gives you the best information about how big a frame is. And actually, this just isn't true. And it basically comes down to exactly what I was talking about as far as the setback of the saddle based on the saddle height. Because again, as the saddle goes up, it goes back. And what the reach does not take into account, the length of the bike, or the cockpit distance that exists behind the bottom bracket, or the reach measurement is simply taken from the bottom bracket horizontally forward to the head tube. So there's all this distance behind that can create problems. For instance, there are many bikes out there that have the same reach measurement, but the overall and what ends up as the cockpit distance ends up being much greater on one of the bikes because of the seat angle, and because there's more distance and more length to the cockpit behind the bottom bracket. So we need to add in the setback that we have from his saddle height, add in then the reach, and then add in the length of the stem, and that gives us, to some extent, our more of a complete determination of the cockpit of the bike. It worked out that we were able to go with this very short 32 millimeter stem. Part of the reason we were able to do that is because these handlebars are a little bit wider than what he is currently riding. And when you're riding, especially on a mountain bike, as your hands go wider, they're not projecting forward as much. And so it effectively shortens our reach. If, for instance, he had a much narrower bar on here and his hands were closer together, I think this 32 millimeter stem might be too short in that case. And now also, so then the last thing we needed to kind of hash out was with bar height. This is pretty easy on this bike because it is a 29er. It is a 29 plus bike. We tend to have fairly high bar positions. This client had some special considerations with his back, with his hips, with his knees. And so I just went with, for now, what I usually do, which is I left as many spacers or nearly as many as we're allowed to, and I cut the steer tube to that longer than average length perhaps. And I did so because we can always cut more later. We can always, if he doesn't, if we don't need all those spacers, we don't need all that bar height, then we can always cut the steer tube and remove the spacers. It's not a big deal. Now we do all this math. Again, it's a little bit of trigonometry to figure out a couple of the measurements, and then it's just some basic addition and subtraction to kind of determine our total reach for the bike. On other bikes, especially road bikes, we would also do some measurements for bar height. We have a little less constraint for this particular rider and on this particular bike, but when we're doing that for bar height, it's the same thing. We would take into account the stack of the bike. You could also consider the head tube length. That'll kind of go hand in hand. And the number of spacers, etc. And it's simple addition and try and make sure that we're getting the right bar height. And of course, you factor in the stem's length and rise into that equation as well. Now, I will say one thing to be careful of is, and this happens every single time I do this, I can be as careful and as accurate as possible, and then we always end up with small differences. It's just not going to be 100% accurate. I get to usually within a few millimeters, but there's always going to be some minor fiddling that goes on. And that's why I do all this work ahead of time, is if there's going to be small differences when I'm really doing all this due diligence and doing all this work, what might happen if I wasn't that careful? We could end up way off and need, a completely different stem or a completely different seat post. I'm just, by being as granular as I can, I'm limiting the potential trouble I could get into with, picking the wrong bike part then. It just makes me that much more accurate. But it's often not going to be exactly on the money to the millimeter, what you project it to be, but you can get pretty darn close. So that's all for this one. Again, I can go into more of a build and I will certainly try and post some pictures on my Instagram of this bike when it's finished, so you can follow me there. But if you have any questions, put them down in the comments below, and I'll try and get to those when I can. And thanks for watching.